was a good crowd. We probably should have charged admission for this.
Probably should have. Fundraiser.
Yeah. Before I get started talking about some of these stories, I want to tell you a little about how I got interested in this topic. When I was a kid, sometimes we'd go stay with my grandparents, and they lived in Conway, so we'd stay all weekend. And what they would do is they would take their tithe money for the upcoming Sunday, and they put it in a book and leave it on the shelf. Well, sometimes they'd forget which book they put it in. And so it became this big treasure hunt for us kids to look around through the books on the shelf to see if we could find the money that they forgot about. And so I got really well acquainted with a lot of the books that were on the shelf. And one of the books that was there was a book called Ozark Tales and Superstitions. And I loved that book. I read that book cover to cover numerous times. In fact, if I thought hard enough, I'd be able to remember exactly which illustrations went with which story. And so now that I'm a grown up and supposedly not supposed to be interested in such things, and a quote unquote professional historian, I thought it would be fun to kind of look at some of these stories and see what is the historical background for why we believe some of these things to be true. So I would be remiss if I didn't start our tour of Arkansas by talking about the building that we are in right now. And in 1837, they had a squabble over what was at that time a very important topic. They were arguing over wolf pelts. This is at a time when a pelt could kind of bring in about $4 a piece, and they were arguing over how much money these wolf pelts would bring. In fact, if you look at the newspapers at the time, they wouldn't call them wolf pelts, they'd call them wolf scalps, which makes it kind of disgusting to me, but that's what they called them. And so they had a very heated squabble in the legislature, and during one of these debates, John Wilson, who was Speaker of the House, he was from Clark County, he got into a squabble with a gentleman named J.J. Anthony, and this squabble went from being just a verbal argument and eventually escalated into a knife fight. So this knife fight ends up leaving Mr. Anthony dead on the floor of the legislature. And today people say that you could see some entity or spirit walking around the old Statehouse. And people suggest maybe it was Mr. Wilson who was the killer in this story. John Wilson ended up being acquitted for killing Mr. Anthony. But he was expelled from the House. So he was no longer in the legislature. He went back into private life. He tried to rebuild his political fortunes later on to no avail. And so he was pretty much a ruined man by that point. And some say that that entity that's roaming around the old Statehouse happens to be him. And he's just kind of lost in this building. I was here last year giving a talk, and I had a gentleman who was a maintenance worker come up to me and tell me that he had been working in this building that morning and had seen a woman walking around in period dress, and this is before anybody was even supposed to be in the building. So it could be a homeless person who has raided a thrift shop, I don't know. So from there we're going to go down to Mr. Wilson's home county, down to Clark County. And in rural Clark County, there's this set of railroad tracks down there. And it's become kind of a famous place, kind of a legend-tripping type of place. Students from Ouachita and from Henderson like to go down there and have a look at what has been called the Garden Light. And it's something that's become pretty famous. I have a t-shirt here. Hopefully you can see it. And they really try to advertise this here. It says, welcome to Garden. We'll leave the light on for you. And it's something that I've seen myself. I was down there with a group of friends maybe 20 years ago, and we were walking along the tracks about 2 in the morning and saw this strange light appear in the distance that bounced up and down and back and forth. And the legend has been always that it's maybe the ghost of a railroad brakeman who lost his head, and now he's roaming the tracks with his lantern hoping to find his head, which of course begs the question, if he doesn't have a head, how's he going to find anything without eyes? But that's the story that's been told. And when I started to look into the history of this story, it became apparent that one of the stories, historical stories that it's tied to, is an event that happened in 1931 in Garden. And that time there was a train was rolling through town, got out of town, and suddenly derailed. And so they weren't sure exactly what happened. It just appeared to be a minor accident. Nobody was injured. The train had been going slow enough that no one was hurt. And so they went out to investigate, and they found in the bushes, they found a packet of tools. So it was obvious that somebody had maybe sabotaged the tracks at some point. Well, a group of workers got out there to try to repair the tracks, and among them was a gentleman named Will McLean, and he was leading this. He was the foreman of this work crew, and he had a couple of people, one named George Brewer and another named Lewis McBride. McBride was Brewer's nephew. And they started work, and then they started to argue with each other. Apparently, Mr. McBride had not paid his union dues, which is a pretty important thing if you're working, for a union shop. So they started to argue, and eventually, Mr. Brewer gave up. He said, "This is not worth my time," and left the crew. Well, the argument continued this time between Lewis McBride and the railroad foreman, or Lewis McBride and Mr. Brewer. And eventually, the foreman and McBride came to blows, and McBride picked up what's been called a railroad awl, which is kind of this large hammer, and hit him on the side of the head. Almost took his head off. It was a pretty tough blow, and then he fled back to Garden after hitting the foreman. Well, the foreman somehow was able to drag himself away from the site. They had evidence that he had been trying to make it back to Garden. He didn't quite make it before he collapsed and died. Well, because this was a large work crew, it became very obvious who the killer was, and they ended up taking him into custody, and he would be tried and convicted of first-degree murder, and he would be executed just a few months later. They did it really quick back then. Well, so that's the story. The question is, okay, well, if that's not a headless brakeman, what is this light that people have been seeing? There's been several attempts to try to explain what's going on. There have been some amateur attempts to actually catch the light. There was a newspaper article I looked at from November of 1975 where this gentleman took a lawn chair and sat it on the tracks and sat there waiting for the light to appear. Oh yeah, and he had his shotgun with him, in case he wanted to, shoot the light, I guess. Well, luckily for the light's safety, it never made its appearance that night, and the guy ended up just kind of going back home. There's been other attempts. Some scientists have suggested maybe it's swamp gas, which is this phenomenon where decaying vegetation ends up rotting, and the gas gets in the air and somehow ignites and causes flashes and things like that. Other people have suggested maybe it's a reflection from the interstate that people are seeing. Well, for my part, these scientific explanations are not near as fun as believing that there is a headless brakeman out there looking for his head. I kind of agree with the author of the Celine Courier article about it, who said, "I know nothing about the scientific explanation, but frankly, I prefer the supernatural one." Well, so it's kind of like that. If you've ever seen the movie "The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance," at the end of it, there's the newspaper editor who says, when truth contradicts the legend, print the legend. And that's kind of the same type of thing. And, this light, whether it's, a natural phenomenon or not, it's not likely going to go away anytime soon. I think you can still go down there. Anybody from Clark County?
I've been there.
Yeah. From what I hear, they've taken up a lot of the tracks, maybe, the trestles, so that you can't go down there, which is a shame. So from there we can go up to Fayetteville, and there's a lonesome valley up there near Fayetteville that's been called Ghost Hollow, and it's got this strange name for a reason. The story goes that in the 1850s, there was a couple who were from Fort Smith, and they moved up to Fayetteville. Apparently on the wedding day, I don't know. It would have to be the wedding day in order for the story to make sense. But the story goes, they go up to Fayetteville, and they're settling into their new home. And she is still wearing her wedding dress. And she goes over to the fire and tries to stoke the fire to get it to flame up, and a spark bounces off and lands on her dress. And unfortunately, she hadn't learned the old rule that we all know, which is stop, drop, and roll, and she runs outside and runs into the night, and of course, she ends up burning to death, and the entire hillside. So people since then have heard the sound of a screaming woman running through this area. It has a lot of history to it. There's an old Civil War era cemetery there as well that supposedly has some activity to it. It's been a kind of a popular hiking spot for years. When I was looking into this story, looking at old newspaper articles, I noticed all these stories about these Sunday school socials that were being held out in Ghost Hollow, which seems kind of strange to me. But some people have tried to explain away some of these stories. There was a woman named Ida Nur who bought the property in the 1950s, and she suggested that there's really nothing to any of these stories, that these stories were made up by gamblers who were supposedly having their illegal games in the valley there. It's kind of like the Scooby-Doo thing, you come up with the ghost, and that makes people stay away. Well, the stories have continued, though. There's one person who claimed that they went into that old Confederate cemetery and saw a statue there during a heavy downpour, put down his sword and cover himself with his cloak. Fred Starr, who was a columnist for the Northwest Arkansas Times, he wrote in August 21st of 1940 about a local legend to combine with the screaming bride, that there's also a headless horseman who runs through the area. So this place has all kinds of different things going on. Also, the Northwest Arkansas Times reported in October 28th of 1973 that an anonymous resident who lived in the area reported seeing other things that happened in the cemetery. And so he decided he was going to investigate. Well, lucky for him, he happened to get a correspondent who wrote him a letter, and this correspondent claimed to be a ghost who apparently had a typewriter, and he called himself Jacob. So, according to Jacob, he roams the area because he's curious about human beings. So he's as curious about us as we are about him. Well, he said the reason why all these ghosts are kind of wandering around is it's the penalty imposed on ghosts of the first order by the Great Ghost Council. So so ghosts are not necessarily something that we are necessarily always afraid of. I mean, they're trotted out at Halloween. We're all here. Tomorrow's Halloween, and but as for me, I don't really think about ghosts all the year round. And it may be that the modern world is too sophisticated for ghosts. I don't know. Well, Mr. Starr, who wrote the article about about corresponding with Jacob, he ended up writing, "Our country has become more thickly settled with less territory for ghosts to stalk over. Perhaps our automobiles are having something to do with the shortage of ghosts. There just doesn't seem to be any place in the setup for a modern world for honest ghosts." So just keep that in mind next time you're in a ghost hollow and happen to hear the sound of a screeching woman. Just south of there in the town of Mena in 1960, there were some weird things that were going on. Ed Shin, who was a local farmer there, he and his wife Bertie were living there with their grandson Charles Elbert Schaefer. And they were living in a farmhouse about 3 miles out of town. Well, suddenly they started hearing these strange noises around the house. Some knocking, things like that. Well, they kind of dismissed it as the house is settling, nothing to worry about. Well, then the windows started rattling, and this kind of continued over the space of a couple of weeks. It kind of started to escalate. Sometimes the noises were even stranger. It sounded like somebody was running a handsaw up in the attic at one point. And one night the noises were so intense as they were laying there, Bertie hollered out to whoever would listen, "Would you please let us sleep?" And she heard a voice come back. And the voice said, "No." And she said, "Well, why don't you go to sleep?" And he said, "Well, I don't need sleep." And she said, "Well, would you at least let us sleep?" And the voice said, "You don't need sleep either." Well, the activity continued to intensify throughout November. Suddenly they started seeing chairs fly through the room. Things like marbles would fly, and they'd leave the house, come back, and all the furniture would be rearranged. Things like that. It's very strange things were going on. Well, they decided they were going to kind of keep all this to themselves. They didn't want to tell anybody that this weird stuff was going on. And, it soon became public knowledge. Unfortunately, Bertie happened to be visiting her local butcher and accidentally told the butcher that all this stuff was going on in the house. How this happens accidentally, I don't know. But the local butcher, of course, because everybody has to visit the local butcher, he has to tell everybody. And so soon, the entire town of Mena knew that there was something strange going on at the Shin house. The butcher actually told the newspaper, "I guess I must have started it all. I got worried and sent a neighbor out to check on it." Well, pretty soon neighbors started gossiping about the house. People would say that they drove by and saw the mailbox levitate out of the ground and spin around. And somebody said that they saw a dog food can fly across the room. People actually started just kind of barging in the house because, why not? there was as many as 300 spectators a night would just walk in the house while the Shin family is trying to enjoy a little privacy. And Mr. Shin told the paper, he said, 10 people came in and went all through the house the other day and didn't say a word. Well, eventually the police showed up and they keep people from just kind of barging in the house. But because this became kind of a local story, the newspapers started covering it, and then the national press also picked up on that there were strange things going on in this house in Mena. The parapsychology laboratory at Duke University actually got involved talking about what was going on in this house. They called it what they said they thought it resembled what they called a poltergeist, which is it's German for noisy ghost. It's this idea of a ghost would be kind of a trickster and would throw things around and be kind of just noisy in general. So the activity continued, and Shin finally decided that he'd had enough, and he got his wife and his grandson, and they left the house. They decided they were going to leave, and in their place, the Polk County Sheriff was going to stay the night in the house along with the press and some reporters, and they would try to see if they observed anything that was going on. Well, they went all night and didn't see a thing. And John Egger, who was one of the deputies in the house, he wrote, or he told the Associated Press, he said, "There's no doubt queer things have been going on around here. I just can't explain it." Of course, nobody believes in ghosts anymore. Well, Shin decided that no ghost was going to keep him from his house, and so he ends up taking his family, and they move back in the house. And he started believing, well, he doesn't think it's a ghost. It has to have some other reason for what's going on. And he pointed to the ongoing Cold War as the reason for the strange events going on in the house. He said he believed that it was nuclear testing was somehow causing things to fly around his house. And he ends up actually having somebody come out and bring a Geiger counter to test the house to see if there's any radiation. Well, of course, there's no radiation in the house. One of his neighbors, a gentleman named J.L. Ply, he told the press, the press was there constantly, and of course they'd go to the neighbors and ask the neighbors if they saw anything. And Mr. Ply told the press, "I talked to a smart fellow about this thing once, and he told me it might be caused by uranium brought in through their well." So with that kind of debunked, the sheriff decided these strange happenings around the house can't have a supernatural reason for them. And he thought, well, there's one person I have not talked to, and that is the grandson. So he goes down to the high school and he pulls the grandson out of school and sets him down and starts talking to him. Well, it's not too long before the grandson finally admits he's behind the whole thing. He told the sheriff that what happened was he had been upset because his grandparents had been picking on him. So he decided he was going to pull pranks on them and get them back. Well, he was actually sobbing, according to the newspaper. He was a lot of remorse there about having done this. Well, because this actually, one of his favorite pranks was to wait until his grandparents left the room and then run in and rearrange all the furniture. And then, of course, they'd come back and the furniture would be rearranged as a ghost. Another thing he liked to do was go outside the room and throw a marble into the room and then run in and say, "You see that?" And he actually got caught at one point. He said that his grandmother saw him throw a marble once. But he claimed that he had been just throwing it at a cat or something like that. And so she let him go on that one. Well, because this had this kind of pedestrian reason for these things that were going on, they a lot of people were kind of embarrassed. After all, the press had covered this thing pretty exhaustively. And also the people in Mena, especially those who had claimed to have seen things like hovering mailboxes and things like that, they can't have felt very good to be reminded of these things. Well, they tried to salvage what was an embarrassing story. The editor of the Arkansas Democrat, who had covered it pretty extensively, he wrote in an editorial that many smart people believe in such things as poltergeists. Quote, "There's always a chance that a prankster is responsible for weird happenings, as in this case. On the other hand, reputable scientists, neurologists, psychologists, and physicists have investigated cases in Europe, and they are of the opinion that psychic energy may be responsible." Well, I guess the moral to this story is if you plan on pranking your relatives, make sure that the press doesn't find out, because that's going to be embarrassing for everybody. The next story I'm going to tell is not necessarily a scary story, but it is an interesting story nevertheless. Oh, no. Yeah, okay, well, that's what I get. No, that's fine. That's fine. I'll tell this one really quickly. Okay, so Joseph Allen, who was he sold carriages, used carriages, in the late 19th and early 20th century, and of course, people who are selling carriages and horses, they get a reputation, but somehow he was a pretty successful one, and he ended up building this huge house in Monticello that you see there in 1900. He had he moved his wife, Caddy, and their 3 children, Louise, Liddell, and Louis, he liked L names, into the house. Mr. Allen died in 1917. Just a few years before, their daughter Liddell married, but then this marriage between Liddell and her husband didn't last, and they ended up divorcing in 1927. Liddell moved back into the house, and on New Year's Eve, 1948, she killed herself. She drank cyanide, that's a horrible way to go. Her mother ended up sealing off the room where she lived, her room, and but over the years, people had heard footsteps in the house, seen strange things, and also the mystery about why Liddell would kill herself was always, up in the air. People didn't really understand why she would do that. Well, years later, in the 1950s, they started dividing this house into apartments. And while they were doing the renovations, they broke open the room, and they found a cache of letters between Liddell and a gentleman named Prentice Hemingway Savage. And Mr. Savage was a married man that she had been having an affair with. And just a few days before her suicide, he broke it off with her. And so that was probably why she ended up taking her own life. But over the years, people have claimed to see Liddell's reflection in mirrors, things like that. So it's kind of a strange story. And the people who own this house in Monticello now operate it as a bed and breakfast, and they don't shy away from the fact that people say that it's haunted. So, and in fact, the gentleman who owns the house, he has actually written a book, a fictional book telling the story of Liddell and her tragic love affair. So now we're going to go on to the story I said is not very scary, but it's interesting anyway. On the evening of August 20th, 1911, there was a little short gentleman who was kind of traveling through town. He was settled there in Prescott. He was a kind of one of these guys that hops on the train, goes to the next town, and he was selling things like shoestrings and pencils and things like that. So this guy was probably in his 60s. He walked with a limp. It was obviously hard for him to get around. So, they had an open air revival there in the city park there in Prescott. And he sat down to listen to the preaching, and then once that all went away, everybody went back to their homes. And he stayed there in the park, and sometime in the night he passed away. Well, the people who took his body back to the city morgue, which actually doubled as the city hardware store as well, they took him back to the morgue, and they started to try to investigate who was this man, because back then people didn't carry IDs like they do now. And so there was really nothing to identify him. He had a tattoo on his arm of a woman standing on a pedestal, had very elaborate dental work, and that would suggest that maybe he was possibly European, because he followed, whoever did the work obviously followed some of that kind of techniques that they had back then. And there was another woman who was there who was also unidentified, and they called her Old Kathy. And because of that kind of naming convention, they ended up calling him Old Mike. So he was there, and they decided they would just leave him on display, hoping that somebody would come along and see his body and identify him. Well, unfortunately for him, the week turned into a month, and the month turned into a year, and eventually he would stay on display for the next 64 years. They kept him in a back closet, and he became kind of a well-known figure there in Prescott. People would come by to have a look at him. All you would have to do is walk in. You say, "I want to see Old Mike," and they'd say, "Okay." They'd take you to the back, and there he'd be. They would pull back the curtains and turn on the light, and there he was standing there. Because they would take his body every few years down off of display, and they would re-embalm him. They'd burn his clothes and then put new clothes on him, and that would be, he would be ready for the next group of sightseers to come by. Well, Blue Avery, who worked at the funeral home in the 1960s and 70s, claimed that actually a circus came by and asked to buy his corpse so they could put him on display. And he said, well, they couldn't do that because that would just be tacky. Because there were no way of discovering who this gentleman was, they kept him on display. And like I said, people would come by and have a look at Old Mike. Peggy Lloyd, who grew up in the area, told me that one thing, when people would come to town and ask what are the interesting sights to see, she'd try to point them to things like the Railroad Museum, things like that, but they'd be more interested in seeing Old Mike. There were stories I read in the newspaper from the 60s about school children who would take field trips in their buses to go out to see Old Mike. There was another story I heard, and I've never been able to document this or find out whether this is true, but there's a story about teenagers stealing his body at one point and taking him to the movies with them. Kind of a Weekend at Bernie's type situation, I think. Well, eventually, Old Mike who had been on display for 64 years, and there was a worker there at the funeral home who ended up getting kind of disgruntled with the management, and knowing that there had been a law passed in the state legislature just recent to that time, saying that bodies had to be buried in a reasonable amount of time. And I don't think 64 years is anybody's idea of a reasonable amount of time. He ended up calling the Attorney General's office and writing them out. and the Attorney General's office ended up ordering them to bury old Mike. And if you go down to Prescott, you can find his grave. He's got a simple marker. It just says Old Mike on it, and it's got his death date and his burial date. And on top of the Old Mike is a picture of a pencil. And if you go down also to Prescott and go to the Railroad Depot Museum, you can find this. This is a paper mache replica that was made of Old Mike. And just go in there, say you want to see Old Mike, and they take you and they will show you the replica of Old Mike. You may wonder about the eyes here. The thing is, over time his eyes had sunken in, and so somebody thought it'd be a great idea to take little caps and draw eyeballs on them and stick them on his eyes, which makes it even more creepy to me. But I talked to the minister who performed his funeral in 1975, and his idea was, I asked him, what do you say about it? He said, well, the message that he had was that we may not know who he is, but God does. And so now he's at rest. The thing that's really interesting to me is the fact that because he died without a name, that's why we know him. There's kind of an interesting irony to it. So that's the story of old Mike. And like I said, just go down there and have a look at the replica. It is as creepy as you think it's going to be. Okay, so I've got one more story. I'm going to tell about another kind of popular place in Arkansas, and that is the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs. And that hotel is interesting in itself. It has a very interesting history. And because of that history, it makes for some pretty interesting ghosts. It's been kind of a destination since the 1880s. People have been going to Eureka Springs to take the baths. And, you know, bathing, for Victorians, bathing was as important as it was for the Romans. I mean, people would constantly, if you got sick, that's what you did. You went and took the waters, as I said. And so the way to talk about Eureka Springs is to talk about how it got started. There was a judge who was having some physical ailments, according to the stories, and he ended up asking his doctor what he should do, and the doctor said, well, go up to Eureka Springs and have a go at some of the baths. Well, this man, Judge Sanders, he went up there, and the responses that he got from taking the baths were pretty extraordinary. He claimed that not only did it heal his leg ailments that he had, but the waters helped him to lose 40 pounds. And as he wrote, quote, portions of my hair changed from yellowish white to black, its original color. The color of the hair then grown was not changed, but a new crop grew out of the scalp of the color of my hair in younger days. So it also cures baldness. So that's a great for people like me. So what more could you want out of a vacation spot? It seems that these waters were also claimed to cure other ailments as well. They claim that it could cure blindness, paralysis, liver complaints, asthma, and chronic constipation. Maybe all at the same time. And there were plenty of doctors who would attest that this was true, that this was something that was actually happening. And by the mid-1880s, people were flocking to Eureka Springs. Newspapers in Texas actually were advertising the town as the best destination for Texans. And this is also the environment that some enterprising businessman who was led by former Governor Powell Clayton gathered several people in the town together and decided they would build this elaborate hotel. And when they started budgeting for it, and they had an architect come out, and he quoted them the price of $250,000, which is a staggering amount of money. That is about $5 million in today's money. So that's a lot of money to try to bring in to put a hotel out in the middle of nowhere. But nevertheless, they were able to raise the money. And as they started working on the hotel, that's when the hotel gained its first spectral resident, when an Irish bricklayer actually plunged to his death while they're constructing the building, and supposedly he's still there. But what this hotel soon ended up not really making a lot of money. Fortunes of the town ended up taking a hit. It became easier to get to Hot Springs than it did to Eureka Springs. So a lot of the people would start going to Hot Springs instead. And most bathers also found other towns that were much more accessible than Eureka Springs. So the hotel was struggling to try to make ends meet, and eventually they would only be open in the summer, and even that wasn't good enough. They were still struggling. So eventually they ended up closing, and in 1906 the hotel began its second life as a women's college. And this women's college is interesting in that some of the rules for the students at this college were pretty quaint by our standards. Once arriving at the new college, young women were only allowed to carry a few things with them. They were a Bible, a raincoat, a napkin ring, and an umbrella. Beyond these essentials, students had to get permission to bring additional items with them. And of course, the clothing was kind of this plain black dress. So no doubt these restrictions were designed for a purpose. They were supposed to keep these women away from any kind of distractions, and also keep them chaste and so forth. All this protection came at the yearly cost of $400 for tuition. That's a lot of money for 1906. And this is at the time that the second ghost makes its appearance. And now people have seen a young woman who was either pushed or fell from the balcony there at the hotel. And she's been seen walking the grounds at night, still wearing her modest dress. Well, over the years, even the college struggled to kind of make ends meet, and it ended up closing. And in 1934, it began what is probably the most interesting part of its story, when a medical huckster by the name of Norman Baker made his way to town. Now, Mr. Baker was from Iowa, and he was kind of known as a medical huckster even in Iowa. He sold what he claimed were cancer cures, and he owned a lot of Mexican radio stations, so he could broadcast all across the country all about his medical inventions without any kind of FEC prohibitions against that. So he had this sketchy past, and he's also very flamboyant. He's known to wear all purple, and he drove a purple car. So this is before Prince. Maybe this is where Prince got his fashion sense. But so in the 1930s, people started to think maybe there's not much to this medical cure that he's been hawking. And the medical establishment there in Iowa actually got a hold of one of his medical cures, his cancer cures, and to analyze it. And what they discovered, it was nothing more than watermelon seeds, clover seeds, corn silk, and water. Well, pretty soon a grand jury ended up indicting him for practicing medicine without a license, and he ended up paying a fine and then leaving town. And unfortunately, the town he ends up arriving in is Eureka Springs in 1938. He comes to Eureka Springs and he buys what was then a vacant hotel, and he buys it for a song. He buys it for really cheap. He claimed to be a cancer expert, and he opened it as what he called the Baker Hospital. He doubled down now on his claims. Not only is he able to cure cancer, but he's also able to cure everything else, basically. And as we know from testimony that came out later from his trial for mail fraud, he claimed that, or people claimed that he would have healthy people sit on the balcony and claim that these are his cured patients. Well, hundreds of cancer-stricken people would come to this quote-unquote hospital hoping to get cured, and unfortunately they'd be waiting a long time, and most of them would probably die. Well, it's not long before Baker's claims also came to the attention of Arkansas's medical establishment and the federal government. And in September 22nd, 1939, federal court indicted Baker for making dubious claims through the mail. And so he ended up being convicted in federal court, and he would actually leave Arkansas after that, after serving his prison sentence, and he'd head down to Florida, where unfortunately he didn't seem to learn much from his previous escapades with the law, and he went right back to selling quote-unquote cancer cures while he's in Florida. Well, not long after that he would die. Anyone have an idea what he died from? It's kind of ironic. Maybe it's justice, I don't know. Well, it's been said that a lot of people have seen some of these old patients who are probably still sitting there in the hotel waiting for their cancer cures, walking the grounds. Some have said that the most activity happens to be down in the basement, which during Baker's time served as the morgue. Some people have also claimed to even see Baker strolling the grounds at some point with his purple suit on. Well, today the Crescent Hotel is one of the most popular tourist attractions in the town. People just go just to see how elaborate this hotel is. Even if they're not staying there, they enjoy coming to see it. And probably there's a lot that come to see the ghosts out there. But if you do go up there to have a look at the ghosts, just know that not all of the ghosts at the Crescent Hotel are scary. The bricklayer that I mentioned earlier seems to have a sense of whimsy. He's been known to play pranks on his hotel guests. For instance, during the summertime, turning on the heat as high as he could get, and the air conditioner during the wintertime. There's another ghost who has been seen who supposedly will fold your clothes if you leave it out there. So if you don't want to do your laundry, or make sure maybe she could do your ironing as well. Another ghost, her name is Theodora. That's the name they claimed for her. Well, the rooms that these ghosts are in are usually the most popular ghosts there, or popular rooms there at the hotel, and they usually have a long waiting period. So if you're ever interested, you might want to make sure you get your reservations pretty early. Well, the hotel's they don't shy away from their ghostly past. They give ghost tours there, so they don't shy away from it. So even if you don't believe in ghosts, but the hotel itself, its strange history is enough to be interesting anyway. I'm going to tell one more story, and this is a quick one. In Arkadelphia, about in the fall, they have the Battle of the Ravine, and there's a legend that goes along with the Battle of the Ravine between Washita and Henderson State. And the story goes that there was a student named Jane from Washita who started dating a man named Joshua who was from Henderson. And it was right around the time of homecoming, and Joshua's friends kind of got on to him for dating this girl from Washita. And eventually he ends up breaking up with her. Well, she is just distraught. And of course it's homecoming, and she learns that Joshua has a new date, and he's going to the homecoming dance with her. And so she, in her distress, goes to the top of the ravine and hurls herself off and kills herself. Now, that's one version of the story. If you go to Henderson, the story is absolutely reversed. It's the Washita boy that is the one that causes the problem. Well, today, one of the legends is that she has been seen in, if you're at Henderson, she is in Smith Hall. And what you'll do is right around the time of the Battle of the Ravine, check and see what clothes she's wearing. What colors is she wearing? If she's wearing, the color of Washita, then Washita is going to win, and vice versa for the other team. And the version for Washita has it that she is in Cone Bottoms Hall. And so that's the story of the Battle of the Ravine ghost. So if you ever want to make a bet on the Battle of the Ravine, just try to see if you can find the ghost, and then bet accordingly. So that's all I have. Anybody have any more questions?